Okay, here we are with episode 9 of 10 Days That Unexpectedly Changed America. And that shirt that you saw there is when the object of um, chapter 9, Elvis Presley, visited President Nixon in 1970, trying to become an undercover agent. It's a true story, trying to become an undercover agent to kind of find out about the youth culture and those who were taking drugs. Of course, Nixon kind of refused that. Anyway, chapter 9. Here's kind of an overall summary, then the details of the chapter. By 1955, the glossy image of conformity and consensus of American middle class culture were becoming deeply reinforced by television and mass media. By the mid 50s, there was a shared national culture where no one seemed to ever be sick, no one was poor, families were always intact, men went to work during the day, women stayed at home, and African Americans were invisible. Elvis Presley's performance on The Ed Sullivan Show in September of 1955 symbolized the emergence of a new youth culture that would transform American culture and politics of the modern era. No longer would the youth wear the same style clothing, watch the same TV shows, listen to the same music. Elvis created a whole new set of cultural options for young people, stirred a mixing of black and white races, and defined an entire generation. He gave voice to a youth revolt that touched off a social revolution in the 60s and 70s that would soon turn into a political revolution. The details of the chapter. Ed Sullivan, one of the main characters of this chapter, hosted a TV show that was called The Toast of the Town from 1948 until 1971. He was kind of an odd choice. He wasn't particularly good looking and had a lot of problems with his eyes because of medication that he took and often read things wrong off the cue cards. His program, however, became very popular. Appeared at 8 p.m. Sunday night, and it was all about family values. Sullivan was viewed as a gatekeeper of what was allowed, what was good, and what was bad. And this, of course, is at a time of assimilation in U.S. history. The 1950s is an era kind of that viewed of assimilation, of cultural oneness, so to speak, but it's going to be shaken up here in this chapter. Suburban middle class values seemed to be the norm of the day. Emphasis was on conformity. And this was in the context of the Cold War. Americans have to be good, decent, moral people, or the commies might win. So that was the context of what was going on. However, in this midst of a decade that perhaps can be viewed as one of conformity, there were signs of change. There was a cultural shift that was going on. More women than ever before were entering the workforce. There were changing views of sexual behavior. There was a big shift that was beginning in racial views as the civil rights movement was slowly but surely getting its feet under it. Those things would have been highlighted by the murder of Emmett Till in Mississippi, brought some national attention. Rosa Parks and the bus boycott in Montgomery in 1955, and of course the rise of Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist preacher from Atlanta, Georgia. Another big shift that was taking place was among young people, the youth culture. You've heard the term baby boom. After World War II, there were more children born in U.S. history than any time previous to that. The term teenagers becomes in use for the first time in U.S. in the 1950s, and they had money to spend. New schools are being built everywhere across America, particularly in suburbs, these growing areas outside of cities. And a separate identity for the youth was being developed apart from their parents. This is quite a new thing. Of course, it continues today, but very new of the 50s. The most popular expression of this new youth culture was music. But there's an interesting tension here. The changing music at this time, kind of rhythm and blues, the groundwork for what will become rock and roll, was viewed initially as race music, that is, black music, because it were African Americans who were the ones that were performing it. And that's just where Elvis Presley fits in. Elvis, of course, a white man, but he sounded black. He moved quite differently than Frank Sinatra and Perry Como and some of these other stars of the 50s. It gives a little bio of Presley himself. He grew up, as some of y'all may know, in Tupelo, Mississippi, then Memphis, Tennessee, surrounded by black music, had a guitar when he was young, learned how to play. He was never a great guitar player, but learned how to sing, learned how to dance, again influenced by black music. Sam Phillips began to record his music on Sun Records, and his first song, which became somewhat of a sensation, was almost recorded accidentally, called That's All Right Mama, and Elvis became very quickly a radio sensation. Again, singing and dancing to white audiences, kind of mainstream audiences, but sounding, and you might even say acting and dancing, more similar to black musicians. Eventually, Elvis's contract was bought by a Colonel Tom Parker of RCA Records, and by 1956, Elvis had become extremely popular with hits such as Heartbreak Hotel, Hound Dog, All Shook Up, Jailhouse Rock, things such as that. In terms of the racial context of the rise of Elvis, this is also paralleling changes in civil rights. 1955, I believe it was, you had the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka decision, which ordered the end of segregation of public schools. And Elvis is going to be key, as this chapter views it, of breaking down racial barriers. But at first, you've got to understand that there was a significant backlash against Elvis. He was viewed as evil, kind of corrupting morals of the young people. And don't miss it, this connection with him singing black music was another reason that he was rejected. But still, again, kind of happens today. The more the young people, in essence, were told that his music is bad or of the devil, the more that they wanted to listen to it. He also had a strong sexual appeal, which was troubling to those concerned about traditional values. TV at this time was becoming, as I've already mentioned, very popular, and it was promoting traditional values. Blacks were rarely even seen. Elvis, just because of his radio popularity, began to make appearances on TV, different shows. I won't trace through the different shows that he appeared prior to his very key appearance on Ed Sullivan, but when he appeared on these TV shows, less significant than Ed Sullivan, the popularity and the ratings were extremely high. Ed Sullivan initially does not like Elvis Presley, but he had a hard time ignoring those ratings and eventually booked him for several appearances. Elvis's first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show was a sensation. It is said that 4 out of every 5 TVs that were owned in America were tuned to the Ed Sullivan Show that evening. And again, as I mentioned in the intro, Ed Sullivan is the gatekeeper of traditional values. It's almost as if his appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show gives Elvis a stamp of approval. After his final appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, Sullivan said about Elvis, "This is one decent, fine boy." That statement of approval again. So what this does, his appearance on Ed Sullivan and his ultimate rise to even more popularity opened the door for other rock and roll stars. It led, for example, to TV programs like, most importantly, like American Bandstand, which featured music, rock and roll music that teenagers watched Saturday after Saturday. Ran for a long time. Dick Clark hosted that and just recently died, you may remember. But again, it also broke down racial barriers. more segregation in music now is going to perhaps, and does, you could argue, lead to more integration, I should say, in society itself. Really encourage you to read the last paragraph of this chapter, as it does a very good summary of the overall impact of Elvis himself and his appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. John Lennon, of course, famed member of the Beatles, perhaps summed it up best: before Elvis, there was nothing, is the way John Lennon summarized the significance of Elvis Presley. Only one episode remaining. That's Chapter 10.